Alan. It's good to have you here. And I suppose, first of all, I appreciate everyone doing that for me. I feel we all know each other ever so slightly better than we did 2 or 3 minutes ago. And when it comes to collaboration, one thing that I always have to remind myself is absolutely imperative, even when you're running a bit late, even when you're a bit pressed for time, is not to underestimate the value of giving people the space and time to actually connect on a human level before you get down to business. And collaboration is so difficult where we just jump straight into the transaction. And all of that time before we get down to work, pouring a coffee, making ourselves comfortable, genuinely connecting, all of that time we spend afterwards following up, compassionately and authentically. And that's not the nice to have. That's not the thing that can be cut when we're busy. That's the most important thing of all. And so no matter how short a time we have together, I make sure I never start before I feel we've all had a human connection. And that's probably the most important aspect of everything we're going to talk about before 3:45, actually. When Amy invited me in to talk with you all today, and we can take full advantage of being a sort of small, intimate online group here. Try and make everyone else feel jealous. We're going to have the intimate conversation they can't have in the big echoey conference room. Um, and when Amy invited me here today, I was thinking about there is so much that can be said about communication in general, public speaking specifically, communication and facilitation as a function of collaboration. Where do we begin? And my motivation for trying to boil that down to three things wasn't that there is only three things, but I thought, well, if you were to take three things which you could take away as practical tools, helpful reflections, broad pillars which would underpin communication in many contexts, what would they be? Knowing that we might be quite a diverse group of people coming together. And so I've brought along three broad prompts and questions I find helpful in my own reflection, supported by broad tools and models and frameworks, which I will sometimes delve into when I need that wider support. And what I think these can be is a good starting point for our conversation. But there's only a few of us, and this conversation can go absolutely anywhere that we want it to or need it to before we all head back to the main room in half an hour. And for context, I think it might also be helpful to say just before we start that I come to a public speaking and communications place as someone who is absolutely terrified of it and terrible at it as a student and as a young adult. And through my professional work, and I started working in a children's science museum, then I worked for a long time in a university, then I became a freelance consultant. And now, as I mentioned, I work with the co-production network, working predominantly in the public and third sectors. I found that the ability to communicate, the ability to articulate myself, and the ability to create spaces where others can do the same is perhaps the most valuable asset I have at my disposal. I also know how ineffective I was at that when I started. So I have a lot of confidence that it isn't something you're born with, but is a competence that can be developed with practice and repetition and careful refinement. And so again, the ideas I'll be sharing here are ones which I've tried and tested on myself, and with hand on heart, I can now say I genuinely look forward to opportunities like this one, because confidence in communication means I get to meet interesting people and have good conversations with them, and nothing can give you a greater sense of satisfaction than that. So where it comes to these three areas, I thought I'd structure our conversation around today. The first one is exactly that, and I'll share my screen sparingly, but I will share it at a few key moments. The first theme that I wanted us to talk about was structure. So one thing I was mindful of was reflecting on all of those times I've been in a seminar, in a lecture, in a conference, in any other environment where I'm communicating or being communicated to. And which of those feel like I'm being taken on a journey, keep me sitting upright, or better still, leaning in. Impossible for me to check my messages because I can't bear to miss a single moment of what's about to happen. And how many of those feel like a bingo caller, pulling numbers out of a hat and blurting out disconnected bits of information that I then have to do the hard yards to make some sense of afterwards. And I think one of the key lessons that I try and hold in my mind and always remind myself of is that even if the facts are fixed, even if there is a static set of information that we feel obliged to communicate to our audience, there is potentially infinite ways in which we can take those facts and arrange and align and present them to meet the needs of that audience the right way for the right people at the right time in the right place. And so we should never feel constrained by the information we have to communicate. We should feel empowered by the people in front of us, the tools at our disposal, and the multitude of ways in which we can package and repackage things. And every piece of communication, as far as I'm concerned, is a story. We're always trying to take our audience on a journey from where they are and what they know and how they feel when we begin, to where we need them to be, what we need them to know, and what we want them to feel by the time we're finished with them. And if we think of our communication as a story, it's far more likely to be engaging, to engage our audience, to help them remember and to help them understand, than if we treat it as the bingo call, as saying, here are the facts, do with them what you will. Where that comes to being a reflection that I hold in my mind with the, well, so what? How do I actually do that? A useful starting point, and we can keep this as a rhetorical question, and then we'll go into some practical examples, would be to think, well, imagine they're making a biopic of your life. What's the plot? Think about those autobiographies you've read. Think about those biopics you've watched. It could be a simple chronological narrative from birth to school to your teenage years, to your first job, to becoming a parent, to becoming a grandparent, to the end of your life. So simply putting all of those facts in a chronological order and allowing that chronology to define the journey. It could focus on one particular moment or a set of key moments, the tipping points, the major junctures where life took drastic turns to the right and the left, skipping through some of the less critical elements with respect to the story that you want to tell. It could be organized into chapters, and those chapters might not follow a nice, neat chronology, but they might be thematic. This is about my education. This is about my relationships. This is about the places that I've been. It could be an A to Z, so taking an arbitrary framework, but using that arbitrary framework as a helpful aid memoir for anyone who is watching that biopic or reading that autobiography, the A to Z of Mike. Now, when you come to present and when you communicate your work and your ideas, no matter who you're communicating them to or where you're communicating them, one question I'd have for everybody is, do you consciously reflect on the structures you are imposing on the information? And are there any examples that come to mind of how you actually go about that in practice? I'll stop sharing so we can see each other. Andy, I'm going to pick on you, but not to put you on the spot, but to reflect on what I was thinking watching you a few minutes ago, that you opened with a picture. And it worked very well for me because before you'd started speaking, it seemed like one of those pictures you take when you're just taking your phone out of your pocket and you do it by accident. So I wonder why that's there. You then use that picture to tell us a story. And then that story unlocked the structure that you then walked us through for the theory. So here's a picture. It's real. It's a picture I took. It's a picture which reflects this challenge, which we are walking into with our eyes closed. How do we deal with this challenge? Well, let's unpick it. It's about this point, this point, this point, this point, and this point. So going back to that picture, how do we vision a future where this isn't the case anymore? So you took us on a very, very organically on a very neat story that we were entered into with a real situation. You could have taken that picture away and given us the same presentation, but 3 weeks from now, would I be as likely to remember it? I don't think so. So I think contextualizing it with something real really helped me to connect as I was listening to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for saying that. I have to say, that's probably the 50th time or something I've tried to get that. And actually having that 10 minutes constraint is really helpful because I could talk about that stuff, for hours. Wouldn't be very interesting. But so there's, for me, the structure is super important in terms of where am I in the story, if you like. Is this the middle bit? Is this the bit where I'm trying to pack all the information in and then there's like a question at the end? Or so I do like to sort of storyboard it, if you like, when I put things together. But I think one of the things that I find in a lot of communications and presentations is that I just get lost. And I may have lost some people this afternoon, but what I try and do is so I had a list of 4 challenges, and then I put my, 1 or 2 word ideas next to them. And I think for me, that structure is about that as well. It's about keeping stuff that's been before in somebody's head. It feels like a really important thing to do as well. So it's not necessarily linear. It's kind of parallel sometimes. Am I making sense?
Absolutely, that makes total sense. And for me, I completely agree with that. And I think structure, yes, it's for the audience, but it's our map. And if I don't have a map and I get lost, I have no mechanism for getting back. And that's where I can go into the tangents or end up giving a different presentation to the one I started giving. If I have my map, if I have my structure, I can indulge a tangent, I can run with an example, I can take a question, and I can find my way back again. Or I can refer to the map to answer the question or to bring some context to the tangent. So that structure for ourselves and for our audience, like I said, keeps everything glued together and helps us navigate what are often very complex and technical things that we're needing to find a common ground and a common language to work our way through. If for anyone, and again, we're moving through things at a pace really today where we can introduce the questions to ask rather than provide all the answers. But if you want to indulge yourself in what structures mean and how we can play with ideas around structure and how we can translate different ideas into our work, one text which can be helpful it's a long book, so maybe to read cover to cover, but certainly to praise some of the headline ideas to get creative juices flowing can be the 7 basic plots. And for those who are not familiar, the broad thesis in the 7 basic plots is that take any story and it'll fall into one of 7 categories. Contested theory, but an interesting one when we have our blank piece of paper in front of us and reflecting on what kind of story am I trying to tell. So I'll walk you through each very briefly, and then we'll move on to something connected, but ever so slightly different. So the first plot, Christopher Booker claims in his thesis, is overcoming the monster. They're stories where our protagonist wants to defeat an evil force which threatens them. It's every superhero film. And so overcoming the monster can be a great plot to use when we're trying to galvanize an audience to take what we're presenting to them as a heroic action. I find it's particularly helpful when we want our audience to be the protagonist, when we want our audience to be the superhero. We face this great global threat, and you know who can save us? You can. And how can you? With your bravery, with your strength, with your tenacity. So if you want to present the significance of the challenge and empower the audience to overcome that challenge through their heroic action, through their bravery, overcoming a monster can be really powerful. The second is one we'll all be familiar with. It's rags to riches. It's when we have something and then we lose it and then we gain it all back. If you cast your mind back 2 or 3 years, we'd all be rich if we'd had £1 every time we heard the phrase build back better. And why was it so advantageous for our politicians to use this rhetoric? Because they were in power before the pandemic. They were hoping to be in power after the pandemic. And we found ourselves in the midst of the pandemic. So their narrative was things were great before. It might be tough now, but keep voting for me and things will be great again. And so if you want to allow people to hark back to a positive memory of the past, to galvanize and motivate them for what can be a positive future, then that rags to riches can be a really important narrative. What can we learn from the past? What can we take from what was good? And how can we use that to make things good again? Again, in the context of, for example, climate change, it's often looking back to the halcyon days of our grandparents where there were no cars on the road and people, cooked from fresh ingredients and waste not, want not. And the sort of that nostalgia can be part of the driver that leads the positive future focused action too. The quest is another one where our protagonist sets out to get an important object or to a location and faces obstacles and temptations along the way. It's Homer's Odyssey, it's Lord of the Rings. And here is, if we're going to use this narrative, it's very much where the end is not necessarily in sight, but we need to motivate people for the journey. So again, in the context, Andy, of your presentation, a quest narrative may be, this just transition is not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick. But step by step, if we overcome the obstacles, if we never lose sight of the end goal and the importance of that end goal, we can get there and we can achieve something special. And the journey is as important as the destination. And where that's true, the quest can be a powerful narrative. Voyage and return, I suppose you could say, is a little bit like a quest where you come home at the end. Now, voyage and return is an interesting one because I find that's a powerful narrative where we want to qualify our story with our own lived experience. So if we're saying, look, I've been there, I've made these mistakes, I've got the t-shirt and I'm coming to talk to you so that you don't have to make the mistakes I made, or you can learn from what I saw. And we're using voyage and return. And again, that's something that often we use when we're working with our professional and lived experience and creating spaces where we can each talk about our own voyage. We all have this collective return and we can all be the richer for it. The next two really work as a couplet, comedy and tragedy. They're not so much necessarily about being funny and bursting into tears, but comedy is where we seek triumph over adverse circumstances, and tragedy is where character flaws are ultimately the falling or the failure of our good character. Where I see comedy work powerfully, it's where we can give hopeful success stories, the positive case studies, the things that are working well, the testimonials of the people who've had the successful outcome. And where we have tragedy, it's those cautionary tales. These people didn't take this action, and look what happened next. Let's look at what will happen if we don't focus on a just transition. What could go wrong? And so where we want to create visions of the future with a combination of carrot, which is our comedy, and stick, which is our tragedy, they can be really powerful narratives. And last but not least is rebirth. So it's Christmas. I'd say this would be a Christmas Carol and pretty much every other Christmas film I can think of. So where you have a story where you want people not to have a slow evolution, but a fundamental revolution, then rebirth is the narrative that you want to tell. And so, again, I talked about Build Back Better earlier, and I remember in Wales, whilst we had our First Minister saying Build Back Better, we had our Future Generations Commissioner saying fundamentally reconstruct. That's a rebirth narrative. What's the difference? First Ministers have to get their parties re-elected. Commissioners have security of tenure. So where you think things need to be fundamentally different, forget the old, get a blank piece of paper and start again. That rebirth narrative can be a powerful one. Now, struggle to do justice to the depth and richness in those in the few minutes that we have today. But the key point I wanted to make here by sharing them was that every piece of communication needs a structure. We are never limited by the facts as they present themselves to us. And the right structure for us will be contingent on where our audience are when we begin and where we would like them to be when we finish. And we can use frameworks like the 7 basic plots to help us align the things we want to tell with the people we want to tell them to increase our chances of having that effect. And just before we move on to a second technique I wanted to share with you today, are there any reflections on structure from what we've just been talking about? You can interrupt me at any time, of course, Andy.
Yeah, I was just thinking about your rebirth story there, and I recently came across a sort of a story creation approach, I guess. And you'll know this, I'm sure, but it's about the sort of circular way of doing stuff. And there's something called the turn of the story, which is where it's that important event. And I came across it when I was in a group and we were trying to look at what the story of something could be. And we had to decide what the turn of the story was, what that rebirth event was. And actually, it was really interesting because we had lots of elements, and it took quite a long time to work out what was the thing that would actually turn the story from, kind of outward journey to return journey. And it's a really important thing to work out, I think, because that's the point at which you really grab people, I suspect. Is,
Yeah.
And then, I woke up and I knew exactly what I had to do. There's like a thing that happens that you that then sets that course and probably sets the structure for the second bit of it. So yeah, I really like the rebirth part of it.
Thanks, Andy. And again, connected to that, I think something I always hold in my mind, and we're doing it right now, of course, is reflecting on, will my audience be an active audience or a passive audience? If I give my audience the opportunity to simply sort of turn their ears off and let what I'm saying wash over them, then it might look like communication from a distance, but it's not. It's a series of disconnected monologues. If I bring my audience in through questioning, through conversation, through interaction, or even through rhetorical questions, imagine this, then they are becoming an active audience. And so one thing when I sense check anything I'm ever communicating with people is, am I giving my audience the opportunity to be active? Can they connect this to their own thoughts, their own experiences, their own lives? And if not, I need to do better. Welcome, Nigel. We're in the flow, as you've seen, and we're just about to move on to our second of three very broad reflections. And we've got about 15 or 16 minutes to go before we all go back to the main room, so plenty of time. The next thing I wanted to talk about was delivery. So after structure, and I felt that it's absolutely critical that any piece of communication has structure. At some point, of course, we have to stand up and say it, to put it that way. And one thing I'm always mindful of, especially in the context of collaboration, and especially in the context of sort of academic communication and communication of technical work, is the importance of common vocabulary and common reference points. So hard to so easy to say, so hard often to achieve. And so often I see that the tensions that can arise in projects at their heart are to do with breakdowns in communication or misunderstandings born out of a lack of commonality of language. Of course, as someone interested in co-production as I am, I'm also mindful that where we use our academic or technical language, whether we do that consciously or otherwise, it can unintentionally impose a power dynamic within a collaborative environment that we didn't intend, that can be unhelpful or even quite damaging. It can be very intimidating walking into a space where you don't know what anybody's talking about. So with that in mind, the task I'll often use with myself, with my own writing, when I'm working with others, is to say, tell me what you do, but I'm 5 years old. So every word that you use has to be a word which a 5-year-old would understand. Every reference point you make has to be a reference point which is relevant to a 5-year-old. And until you can do that, you don't understand what you do. So it's easy to some extent to hide behind our academic language. When I was a student, I studied physics, and if one of my lecturers asked me to describe, what happens in a black hole, for example, I could sort of stutter my way through the answer, name drop a few equations and scientists, and they could fill in the rest. They were much smarter than I was. Then I worked in a science museum. And if a 5-year-old asks me how a black hole works, they're not letting me get away with a thing. I need to know it from first principles, and I need to be able to explain every single step. So in the chat, if you're able to, you all very briefly introduced yourselves 15 minutes or so ago, but in the chat, would you be so kind as to tell me what you do? But I'm 5 years old this time. I'll give you a few moments to gather your thoughts. Thank you, Amin. I like that. I want to encourage people to use the bus or the bike instead of their own cars. It isn't easy for everybody to go out. The way we have made the world is unfair, and I try to find out the best way to make it fair again. I really love that. I talk to people about using drones to make deliveries and how they feel this might change their lives. You're all naturals at this. These are excellent responses. And again, and a couple more coming through. I'll read these out loud. I ask people about times they noticed nature when riding their bikes. We talk about it, and then I share what they did and said with other people so we can all learn from it. Oh, lovely. Nigel, I can see you typing too. And just as you are, just a few thoughts from me on this. Firstly, how impressed I am that you've answered this so well so quickly. It's not an easy question, and some people can really struggle. And a couple of the motivating reasons why I find this a helpful, regular exercise for me when I think about my own communication. Partly is that point I just made, that until I feel I can communicate what I'm doing in this sort of language, I'm not convinced that I truly understand it myself. So it's a good way of measuring our own understanding. Um, it also gives me great confidence, because if you know that you have the tools to explain what you do to a 5-year-old, you don't have to fear your audience or any communication barriers you may encounter, unless you're talking to a group of 4-year-olds. The chances are that you will have the tools to engage anyone with what you do using the reference points and language that are common to them, if you can do it in these base terms to start with. And the second reason I like this is one of expedience. It's that often I think it's easy to fall into a trap if you've got to give a 10-minute presentation on your work, for example, to think, well, I'll write it all down. It'll be 60 minutes long, then I'll try and whittle it down to 10 because I don't want to forget anything important. And we create a very difficult task for ourselves, and we risk trying to over communicate, and we actually swamp and saturate people and make the understanding quite difficult to unpick. Often it's better to make one point thoroughly and clearly than 20 points briefly. And if you start with your explanation for a 5-year-old, it begs the question, how much more complex does it need to be for the people I'm speaking to? And often the answer is not very much, or not as much as you might think. And just to read yours out, Nigel, as well, for the benefit of those watching the recording. I work in the Shropshire Hills, which is a special place that's very beautiful. I'm not too far away, Nigel, so I concur. My job is to help people to come on holiday and enjoy them in ways that don't wear them out, in ways that are good for nature, and to look after them. Perfect. So you've all passed this test. And as I say, it's now about putting your work through the lens of this to think, am I ever using words which could exclude people from this conversation? Reference points which they would find difficult or impossible to engage with? And if so, how can I make simple changes in the way I speak to make sure that when we collaborate, we are all on a common journey together? And just before we move on to that third and final practice I promised in today's presentation, again, for those who want to dig a little deeper into some theory of communication, you can do a lot worse than Aristotle. So hopefully you can see up on the screen now, 3 words. And again, these are 3 words I'll hold in mind wherever I know that I need to be persuasive, when I'm trying to exert an influence over my audience, trying to bring them to a way of understanding that I hold dear. So logos, ethos, and pathos are what Aristotle set out as those sort of 3 fundamentals of good persuasive speech, of good rhetoric. Logos is where our word logical comes from. And so Aristotle said, if you want to be persuasive, be logical. And that's about both how we set out rational, reasonable arguments, and it's how we draw upon appropriate evidence to reinforce and back those arguments up. So an example of logos in my speech may be to say, do we accept that collaboration is a critical element if we're to overcome the challenges being discussed at the conference today? And hopefully you'd agree. That's okay. And do we accept that the ability to communicate is essential if we want to be able to collaborate effectively? And hopefully you'd agree. Let's say, great. Well, do you accept that we as collaborators then should proactively work on our skills in communication and speech to enable that? And if you agree with that, I'd say, great, am I going to see you at 3 o'clock today for my presentation? So that's my appeal to logos in trying to persuade you to be with me today. If you accept each step in the argument, then my conclusion naturally follows. Ethos is where our word ethical comes from. And this was Aristotle saying, we're not so much persuaded by the argument as much as we're persuaded by the person. So it's not just about setting out an argument, but it's about presenting our credentials to be the person delivering that case. It's about our professional experience and training. It's about our lived experience. And it's about an ability to communicate with authority and confidence and compassion that makes people perceive you as a relevant person to be talking to them about this. There's a reason why, just as we were all starting and we warmed up, I told you that I'm interested in co-production, that I've worked in this space in different shapes and forms for years, that I used to have a phobia of this, and I've overcome that phobia. And the things I'll be talking about are tools that I've used. In co-production, I work all over the country. I have a connection to Think through the work we've done together around co-production and collaboration. This was all me making an appeal to ethos. Why shouldn't you just hang up and go and have an extra half an hour off? Because I've got not only some interesting ideas to share with you, but I have some relevant expertise and experience to bring into this space along with them. And pathos is where our word pathological comes from. And it's to feel or to suffer. And it's because it's one thing to know that an argument is logical. It's the rational thing to do. It's another thing to know that the person telling us that is a suitable, relevant authority to be telling us. And yet, in spite of that, why do so many people still smoke? Why do so many people still carry bad habits that I know are bad for them and bad for their families, in spite of what their parents or their children or their teachers or their doctors might tell them? So logos and ethos alone aren't sufficient in many cases. Pathos means we also need that intrinsic motivation to act. What's going to make today the tipping point? What's going to make you finally feel something that motivates the action, even if you already knew it was the right one? And for Aristotle, this is where the oomph that we put into our presentations counts. How can we give people an emotional response through the examples that we use, through the energy that we use, through the connections that we make between our work and their own lives? If we look at the way the climate crisis is discussed now versus 15, 20 years ago, I think we see this very starkly. I mean, if you watch an episode of Planet Earth 1 and then watch an episode of Planet Earth 3, we see it very starkly. I remember when I was younger, the conversation around the climate crisis was typically scientists with graphs talking about parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And now it's Greta Thunberg saying your house is on fire. It's the language of emergency. Attenborough saying, it's in many ways things are too late. We have to act now if we can do anything. And so moving to this emergency language is a strong appeal to pathos. The facts of the matter are established. How do we generate the intrinsic motivation to act? And if we want to be persuasive, it's logos, ethos, and pathos in combination, which are that winning formula. Again, there's one final thing I want to share with you with my final minute we have together, but any reflections before I do? There are so many things we could talk about today. So, Angela, over to you.
Yeah, that was really, really quite enlightening. It was not necessarily reflection, but can we find out a little bit more about, maybe you could put a link if you do find out about the sort of things you do, you personally, so we can perhaps,
Yes.
I don't know, you've got social media or anything to follow you on.
Yeah, I'll make sure before we all leave the call that I share on the screen who I am and how you can keep in touch with me.
Lovely, thank you. No, that was brilliant, thanks.
Well, just with our final couple of minutes again, and I was reflecting on, if I have to pick three things, what should they be? And it was sort of trying to follow my own advice of less is more. Well, I thought every presentation needs a structure. Every presentation must be delivered. But the final thing I thought was that one thing that's often remiss when we talk about public speaking is public listening. And what looks like public speaking and what looks like collaboration is actually lots of people talking into an echo chamber, or lots of people saying their piece and then waiting for the next person to say their piece and waiting for the next person to say their piece, and there being very little in common between all of those different things that are being said. And the ability to listen, for me, underpins our ability to engage in what one would call exploratory dialogue, our ability to learn from each other and build and to get somewhere together that we can't get in isolation. So the tool, the aid memoir that helps me here, is one that was shared with me by a colleague who lives and works in China, when they were showing me around working over there a few years back. And it's the Chinese character for the verb to listen. And it's a compound of other characters that really captures what listening means in a way which is perhaps lost in the English language. And if you're not familiar and if you haven't encountered this before, I'll break down each component here piece by piece. And for each component of this character, there are for me two questions. How can I make myself easier to be listened to? And how can I get better at listening to others? So firstly, we have the symbol for the ear, because if we want to listen, we have to hear. So how can I make myself easier to be listened to? Well, I can make sure that I can articulate, I can speak slowly and clearly. If we're working online, I can find a quiet space, I can use my fancy podcast mic. I can make sure that there is mechanisms through which you're likely to be able to hear the things I'm talking about. And how can I make it easier for me to hear others? Well, I can make sure I free my environment from distraction. I make sure, again, that I've got my volume turned up, that I don't have anything going on around me that could stop me from being able to hear the things you're saying. And if I mishear something, I can ask you to repeat, and I can paraphrase, and I can check that I've understood. Secondly, we have the symbol for the eyes, because we don't just communicate with our words, but with our gestures and with our expressions. So we don't just listen with our ears, but with our eyes. So as communicators, it's remembering that we're not disembodied voices. How can we move, and how can we impasse, and how can we use tools and visual aids? And again, to be better, to help us listen to others, how can we free ourselves from that distraction and really engage in every cue which is available to us? Next is the symbol for one, because to listen, we need to give someone our full and undivided attention. So when I speak to someone, how can I ensure that I hold their gaze, that I lock eyes, that I don't look over their shoulder, that I don't check my watch? If I'm fully connected with them and what they're saying, we are far more likely to engage with each other actively than if I'm trying to multitask. Once I'm focused, I need to be completely immersed in that conversation. Next, we have the symbol for the heart, because we say to listen, you must show empathy. You must try and understand what is motivating the other side of the conversation. If we're not willing to see through the other person's eyes, we are not going to find that common ground, and we're not going to actively be listening to one another. Again, it goes back to that importance of what we said at the very beginning. That time for a cup of tea before you get down to business is what can help to generate the empathy that powers the listening. And finally and critically, it's a symbol for king, because listening is about respect. Even if we don't hold the view of the person who is speaking to us, if we want to listen to them, we have to respect the position they are holding. We can walk away, of course, we don't always have to listen. But if we can listen respectfully, with that empathy in combination, ensuring that we hear someone out, that we give their arguments a fair hearing, and in return expect them to give our arguments a fair hearing, then we are more likely to find a new and common position, or bring someone towards our position, or be led towards their position, than if we are engaged in this disputational dialogue where we are determined not to move and they are determined not to move. So what does listening mean? It means it's what we hear combined with what we see, with focus, with empathy, and with respect. And if we always reflect on the way in which we communicate and the way in which we listen, and measure it against our performance in these 5 areas, we are going to be increasingly better listeners and better communicators as a result. Now, knowing the conference is about to wrap up and we probably all need to return back to that main link, I'll make a note of this in the chat too, but this is my email address. And as you say, Angela, I do run some short courses on communication. I also provide some sort of consultancy and on communication and public speaking and facilitation and the like. And perhaps more to the point, I'm always up for a chat about these things because I find them interesting and I like talking to people about them. So you've got my email address there as well. So if you'd like to keep in touch, you're very welcome to. Really enjoyed having a brief time with you, but a good time together nonetheless. And I'll just share the link now back to the main room, save you all having to try and remember where it was, just when they bring proceedings to a close for the final 10 minutes there. It's a pleasure, Nigel. It felt very brief today, but I've really enjoyed it with you all. If you click on the link I've just shared, that will take you back to the main conference room. I'm going to follow that link as well. And hopefully I'll speak to some of you again in the future. Thank you for your time and for taking part today.